Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Smolenski. I'm an entrepreneur who founded one of the first companies building Bitcoin-based digital identity standards and currently lead business development for Hyland Software's blockchain-enabled digital records solutions. I'm also founder and executive director of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation. Today, I'm going to be talking with you about national perspectives on the adoption of distributed ledger technologies and Web3. I'm going to start by providing an overview of really what's at stake with these technologies, specifically around issues of jurisdiction, authority, and trust. Then I'll dive into a little history of the World Wide Web to contextualize the evolution of blockchain technology. I'll talk a little bit about the Bitcoin stack, including the Lightning Network, a layer 2 protocol, and then considerations for digital identity on Bitcoin. And then I will end by, talking a little bit about the human rights implications of these distributed digital technologies and why they are so important as we move into the 21st century. So with that, let's jump in. Jurisdiction, authority, and trust. These are key themes as the world witnesses a realignment of geopolitical alliances and priorities. What do we mean when we talk about jurisdiction? Well, most straightforwardly, jurisdiction is the legal authority granted to a legal entity to enact justice. Now, you may ask, who grants a legal entity that authority? Well, in principle, there is a community, a society that grants this authority. That means through the process of political legitimation, a legal entity is given sufficient trust to exercise justice. Now, we live in an age where trust is collapsing, both in government institutions, in corporate institutions, in international institutions. And this is a reality of our era that we have to be honest about. And one of the characteristics of an era where trust is collapsing is the birth of trustless, so-called systems, including Bitcoin. A trustless system is also an authorityless system, meaning that there's no one central authority to appeal to. Rather, a community of peers transacts and builds the digital network in a trustless manner. So what does this mean for the practice and exercise of authority today? Well, trustless systems don't simply do away with authority. I mean, that would be impossible. Rather, they become new tools that authorities may make use of in the exercise of their jurisdiction. So in the same way that the internet is a peer-to-peer trustless system, TCP/IP protocol isn't owned by any government or corporation. It's free and open source. Anybody can use it to transfer information from point A to point B anywhere in the world. In the same way, blockchain technology is functioning as a trustless system for the transfer of value. This is particularly important today as we are seeing the traditional monetary and legal system become more and more politicized or seen as politicized, and trust in these institutions is collapsing. So what that means is that we, in effect, need a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, a digital DMZ, to ensure that transacting, even between enemies, can continue. And so even though many governments have been suspicious of Bitcoin, Bitcoin may actually preserve geopolitical and economic stability in contexts where there is unrest and a collapse of trust in traditional institutions. So let's back up a little bit and talk about why Bitcoin is important. we can understand this if we look at Bitcoin in the context of the history of the World Wide Web. So in 1990, we saw the development of the first web protocols, HTML, URLs, HTTP, SMTP. These are all used today for day-to-day digital operations. In the mid-90s, we saw the birth of Web 1.0, the first generation of web applications that included the first web browsers, static web pages, email, real-time news. That began to spur greater internet adoption. And then in the next decade, we saw the birth of Web 2.0, which took that static web and made it dynamic, made it social, made it mobile. So, the first iPhone was introduced, and that exploded mobile computing. The birth of the companies that today, we would know as FANG, Facebook, Apple, Amazon. Some of them were older than this era, but it was really in the Web 2.0 era that they consolidated and cemented their market leadership. So there's no doubt that software is eating the world, and not just any software, web-based software is eating the world. So now we're, moving into an era of cloud computing, of, shared digital infrastructure that is creating economies of scale and efficiencies that were unimaginable, even a few years ago. The problem, however, is that now we have these centralized entities that in effect control all digital transacting that people do on a daily basis. At some point, your use of your own digital identity is mediated by these platforms. Your personal data is being stored, shared, and monetized by these platforms. The data is being made transparent to the government. And so, without any knowledge on your part, you are being surveilled. Virtually anything you do online is considered something you do in public. And this is despite the growth in popularity of digital privacy legislation. The law is always a trailing indicator of social change. The law is slow. The political process is slow. By the time a privacy law is formulated and passed, technology has already advanced a decade further. And so the law is always catching up to technology. And what that means is that there are always new uses that the law did not anticipate that are, in effect, eroding people's privacy without any meaningful recourse. And so what is the solution to this conundrum? Well, Web 3.0 or 4.0 or 5.0, different communities will give it a different number, but in effect, the decentralized web. When we talk about the decentralized web, what we're talking about is the peer-to-peer web. In other words, my ability to transact directly with you across a digital infrastructure without any third parties being involved. That was actually a lot like what Web 1.0 was like before the big Web 2.0 platform companies got involved. And so a lot of what we're seeing today is, in fact, this move back to the promise of the early internet, but with additional protections for user identity and user privacy that the original web was not built with. And so what is enabling this decentralization revolution? Well, it's blockchain technology, specifically Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin white paper was introduced in 2009. The Bitcoin network was launched at the beginning of 2009. White paper actually came out a few months before that. But in effect, early 2009 is when Bitcoin was launched as a peer-to-peer protocol for transacting value online. And that changed everything. So let's talk a little bit about what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is a final settlement layer for digital transactions. You can think of it as a decentralized Fedwire. So Fedwire is used by the US Federal Reserve to every day reconcile the balance sheets of commercial banks with those of central banks. So it conducts final settlement of all transactions that have happened through that banking system. Bitcoin is a digital decentralized version of this. So it provides final settlement in an open network that is accessible globally by anybody to send and receive payments. Now, the robustness and the security with which that settlement has to occur is very high. And so there is an operational cost to maintaining the Bitcoin network. That cost makes Bitcoin as a layer one technology, as a base layer technology, prohibitive to use for everyday expenses like, you know, buying a cup of coffee or going to the store, you know, to pick up ingredients for a meal or something. That is why a layer two network is being built on top of Bitcoin, and that is called the Lightning Network. This is a new protocol that functions like a decentralized Visa or MasterCard network. So it enables infinite scalability on Bitcoin. It enables me to, you know, transact with anybody, do as many transactions as I want. You know, there really are no transaction limits in principle, and virtually free. So the payment channels that are created in the Lightning Network will eventually be closed once transactions are completed. And then those final balances all settle down to the primary Bitcoin network in large batches of transactions. And so in effect, these two networks, Bitcoin plus Lightning, are a new decentralized payment system for the World Wide Web with natively digital cash. And you can see the adoption curve here is significant. So in 1997, there were about 120 million internet users across the world, and that number had reached 1 billion users by 2005. We can see with Bitcoin, we hit 130 million global users by January of 2021, which, you know, Bitcoin was introduced in 2009. That's actually a much higher growth rate than the growth rate for the internet itself. And the Lightning Network is similarly growing in users and transactions by 400% year over year. So even though these networks, Bitcoin and Lightning Network, are still fairly small, they are poised to become mainstream very quickly. Now, there are different types of DLTs. Bitcoin is the paradigmatic example of a universal or global DLT, meaning it is open, it is permissionless, anybody can use it, anybody can validate transactions, anybody can run full nodes of the software, anybody can transact on the network. It's permissionless. That also means there's no Bitcoin authority out there. There's no one group that controls the ledger. By contrast, there are many implementations of DLTs that are controlled by a third party. And these are usually the private or permissioned blockchains that are developed by national or regional governments or by companies or industry consortia. And these are still, you know, being proven out. There really isn't yet a good example of a national regional DLT that has wide usage. Some of them, you know, are in proof of concept phase or in pilot phase, but it's still very early for those technologies. And you can think of these the same way as, you know, intranets in the 1990s, when everybody wanted to have, you know, their own intranet because they felt it would be more private, more secure. It's also very expensive and less efficient in many ways. And so eventually most organizations transitioned to the use of the public internet, whereas, there are still some intranet implementations here and there when they're truly necessary. And so likely that's how DLT adoption will break down as well, is most organizations and people will end up using the Bitcoin stack as kind of the public blockchain. And then there may be private blockchains for specific use cases here and there. The two main use cases that DLTs are good for are money and identity. So Bitcoin really solved the problem of digital cash. It created a peer-to-peer cash system and a final settlement layer for money. So it's an anti-counterfeiting technology. It's a verification technology. And that means it can also be used to verify digital identity and claims. So, if I need to prove to an employer, that I was born on a certain date, I can now have a digital version of that claim that is verifiable against the Bitcoin blockchain, but through many layers of abstraction, so that that data isn't actually recorded directly on Bitcoin. It is recorded using a set of new cryptographic open standards that are obscured progressively. And then the verification, or the thing that is actually recorded on chain, is only a very abstract identifier. So no personally identifiable data actually gets stored on a blockchain. And this is why blockchains can be a privacy preserving technology, even as they enhance trust in the verifiability of digital information. So clearly then, Bitcoin can be used to validate the provenance of digital records. And my company, Hyland Software, has built an application for verifying apostilles, or issuing self-verifying apostilles, which, as you know, is a form of internationally recognized notarized document. These digital records are portable, so you can store them on your mobile phone, take them with you to any jurisdiction. They're independently verifiable simply by clicking a button or scanning a QR code. They're fully interoperable across software platforms because they use well-known data standards, and they're Bitcoin backed, meaning that final settlement is final. So you can have very high confidence in the integrity and authenticity of these records. They're non-repudiable and very secure. So this technology uses a new open standard that is custodied by the World Wide Web Consortium called verifiable credentials. Verifiable credentials are a type of digital credential that are self-validating using identifiers that can be anchored to blockchains like Bitcoin. And again, these identifiers are the only thing that gets anchored to a blockchain. The credential data itself does not. It is stored off-chain, and it is validated using a series of cryptographic functions that make it highly privacy preserving. And so I wanted to end with, some of the human rights considerations at stake here. Why is this technology so important? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the surveillance economy is everywhere, and it is intensifying with every passing month. In effect, you can assume that anything you do in public, meaning outside of your own home or online, is recorded and observed and probably never deleted. This is despite the legal interventions into some of these practices, which have not really meaningfully altered any of the business models around monetization of personal data or the usage of that data by governments to surveil their populations. Despite some pushback from privacy organizations and civil society, the progress of the surveillance economy continues unabated. And so the only real remedy here is to develop digital infrastructures that preclude surveillance in advance. This doesn't necessarily mean that, Bitcoin in combination with these identity standards can preclude all surveillance. But what it does do is it shifts the locus of power back in the direction of the individual. And so there is a kind of rebalancing of power toward the individual, away from the software platform, away from the legal platform. And this is very important because if we are to preserve any semblance of a liberal world order, where the rights of individuals are considered primary to the rights of corporate bodies, then that's going to have to be enshrined in technology architectures that are widely adopted. These same architectures can, of course, as I mentioned earlier, still be used by powerful state and corporate actors, but they also limit what these actors can do. And that is the kind of check and balancing process that is needed in order to preserve a sphere for individual privacy and self-expression in the 21st century. Thank you very much.